Great. Well, we have one question here asking about the way that programs at ARPA-E interact. And so, we have obviously the AMPed program, which is what we're focusing on today. How does that intersect with another program that's looking at, vehicle technologies and batteries such as ranged?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I mean, right now, our main funding mechanism at ARPA-E, we occasionally do these wide open solicitations where we'll take any idea from across the energy landscape. Otherwise, most of our funding opportunities are in these targeted programs like AMPed. And, basically the way the model is meant to work is that we find an opportunity to really push forward a technology vision in an area and to try and solve a problem. And then in doing that, in getting a community of innovators around that problem, we actually learn about other problems and adjacent issues and opportunities for technology. And so, if you just look at what we've done in energy storage for transportation, our first programs on high energy battery chemistries in the BEAST program, one of the things we recognized was that we were doing a lot of work on the chemistries, but a lot of the ultimate system cost and performance results from the balance of systems. So that was one piece that kind of led us to be thinking about AMPed. The other was that, a number of the high energy density chemistries, if you just looked at batteries for consumer electronics and the history of this, right? When lithium-ion batteries were introduced, initially there were some issues around safety, but not really much. The initial failures in lithium-ion batteries were more around electrolyte leakage. It wasn't until we hit a certain energy density that we started having, some real safety issues and catastrophic issues in lithium-ion. And so there is this sense that, we're pushing to higher energy density, but that actually may make the protection and management piece more critical and more important. And so that's kind of an example about how those two programs may line up and interact, sort of one leading to the other. We have a program, I can't talk about it very much because it's on the street right now and it's open, but we have a program called Range, which is taking a very different approach. I mean, AMPed takes the approach of if we always are driving to higher energy densities in the fundamental chemistry, unless we find something radically different from a stability standpoint that can give us high energy density, which is hard to imagine, we're going to keep bumping up against these issues around protection and balance of systems. And so that's sort of what we're trying to address with AMPed. Range sort of takes the other possible solution, which is, can we think of completely new fundamental chemistries and architectures that really solve the safety issue and the control issue before it even starts? So, those are sort of intellectually some of the connections. Practically speaking, if you're a potential applicant to these programs, I think one of the limitations we saw in the model of just having targeted programs is, we come up with an idea like AMPed, we try and get the community engaged, we try and get as many great proposals as we can, but it's in a finite period of time, and then the program closes, and if you had a great idea afterwards, it's hard to know, how do I get in?
Right.
And the program's closed, so we can't, we don't have a funding opportunity to fund more ideas under AMPed. And so that's one of the reasons why it's been important for us to have these open solicitations, because that gives us an opportunity to capture some of the changes in innovation. And we're also trying to keep evolving the model at ARPA-E so we can even do better than that.
Well, so taking it maybe a little bit down a notch into the specifics, we have a question here focused on cost. And they reviewed looking at the technical thought behind AMPed. Where does cost come in? How does that influence, you're looking at try to manage battery performance better, mitigate common areas of failure. Where does the performance and cost equation come in?
Yeah, so I'm glad someone called me out on that. I think the AMP video we did was a lot about the exciting technical opportunities, and we didn't get in as much of the weeds on cost. Cost is obviously probably the most important aspect of all of this. And so I'll go change those overview slides to make it even more clear. In the end, what we found is if you really want to make a practical impact in this area, the biggest barrier to adoption of electric vehicles right now, when you think of batteries, it's not safety, it's not reliability, it is upfront cost. And so we've tried to tackle that in a few different ways. In the way we wrote the solicitation for the projects we're funding, we very much have tried to push the technology. So for a technology that says, we can use better sensing and controls to open up the utilization window of a battery and utilize a larger percentage of the battery. There are a few different ways to look at that. You can say, okay, well, in a vehicle, if I utilize a larger window in terms of an operational window, I can get more range in my battery. Or if I have my controls be more, basically more optimized, I could also improve the reliability or ultimately the lifetime of the system. The other way to look at that is to say, well, the battery initially had to be oversized because you had limited range and it was going to degrade quickly. If you can improve the utilization and you can improve the lifetime, what you should be able to do, if you really want to make a practical impact, is say that you could address the same application with a smaller battery to begin with. And so when we think about the demonstrations and the validations we're doing technically in these projects, we're generally trying to push to show that actually you could do the same job with a smaller battery, which goes to the cost issue. There's another piece of this which basically, is the question of, okay, that's great, so maybe you can save some cost by making the battery smaller, last longer, enabling dual use, etc. But ultimately, these new technologies cost money. And so what's the trade-off? And we have really pushed our projects, and we've done some work, actually. If you follow, I think the newsletter, the AMP newsletter was included with the announcement about this program. And in the newsletter, there was a link to the kickoff workshop that we had for the AMP program. If you find that link, within that, there is one presentation you'll find from a colleague who is working on my team here at ARPA-E, Joe Miller, who basically presented our thought on how we should think about this cost-benefit trade-off. And it's a really important question. Obviously, if the innovation is just the controls and software innovation, then the cost of implementing is pretty low, is low or nothing. And so that's the easiest case. If you're talking about integrating, new advanced sensors, one of the big issues with AMP is it's going to cost you a lot to have that sensor in every cell, and it'll never be worth it. And I guess the thing that I'll mention, and this will be my last point because I've been rambling on this, but I think this is a really important issue. The thing that I'll mention is, if we think about, is it worth spending money for a sensor, an advanced sensor, to help control and protect a cell in a battery pack more optimally? We can think about that from a historical perspective. And we can say, well, let's think about where lithium-ion was, 5-10 years ago. The average cell coming off of a lithium-ion battery plant 5-10 years ago would have been a small consumer cell, maybe an 18650 for a laptop, something like a 2 amp hour cell. So we're basically talking about every unit cell is a $2 product. Okay? And so if I say, well, I've got this really crazy advanced sensor that's going to make you be able to protect that cell and utilize it way better, the sensor is going to cost you $1, right? To put $1 sensor on every cell where every cell costs $2 sounds nuts, never be worth it. If you fast forward to today, now that we've been making automotive batteries with higher capacity, those are much more expensive. Every cell is much more expensive. So a 50 amp hour, or if we think of the future, what if you had a 100 amp hour as your base case cell? That may be that every cell is $50 to $100. And now the idea of spending 50 cents or $1 to drastically improve the utilization or the lifetime of each of those cells doesn't sound so crazy anymore. So we have to think about the trajectory and where we're going to try and really understand, is this stuff worth it?
And how does that factor in with a question specifically looking at the lifespan? I mean, obviously you were talking about one factor of it is the size and whether or not you can change the size of the battery or the cost of the actual component to measure performance. But how does AMP take into consideration lifespan? Is that also part of what you're trying to do with this active management?
Yeah, so I think the AMP techniques, one of the big challenges we have, or the project teams have, is, well, with the AMP techniques that we're trying to explore, we could use those tools to do a bunch of different things. We could use them to basically push the utilization window, potentially to increase the lifetime, but these things are all at odds. So it's a question of, well, which is most important? And lifetime is critical to the cost of the system. I think you have to separate here sort of grid storage to some extent from transportation storage. In a grid storage scenario, you basically say, well, every quantum of throughput energy through my storage system can be equated with some revenue potential. And so maybe all I care about is the total life cycle cost, and I can amortize that, and I've got utilities and other sophisticated investors making the purchasing decisions, right, so that they can all I care about is really the amortized lifetime cost. And so maybe in that case, the thing that I would want to do with an AMP technology is really extend the lifetime dramatically. In the case of an automotive system, what we've seen in sort of all the analysis done in the market is that really people have some expectation of how long their battery or their car should last. Mm-hmm. And the big barrier for them right now is how much money do I have to drop today, right? Is my car going to be $40,000 versus the same car at $25,000 just because it's electric, and how do I deal with that?
Right.
And so being able to add 20% more life to that battery, if you look at the consumer's response, from what we understand and the way the business models work today, isn't as much of a deal as being able to shave 20% off the
right. I might not want to buy a car that you could claim these tires will last for the life of the car. You just have to pay 5 times as much at the beginning, and you'll never replace your tires.
Right.
There's a difference between startup cost and then replacement cost.
Yeah.
Before we move on to the next question, I just want to mention again for anyone that's joined us partway through, this is an open Q&A, so please send in your questions. To do that, you'll look for the WebEx toolbar at the top of your screen. It's a little menu that should slide down when you move your cursor over there. And there's both chat and Q&A. So look for that Q&A box to send in your question. Ilan, the next question is asking, maybe going back to ARPA-E's look at vehicle batteries overall, and wanting to ask about, no program to date has funded specific charging methodologies. And I think that, my experience at ARPA-E really does take a systems approach to thinking about technology. It's not just about making massive improvements in one area unless that one area has a really big impact on the system overall. As you've been thinking about vehicle technologies and battery in particular, how does charging fit into that?
So I would actually say charging, charge algorithms. There are two different pieces. There's sort of the hardware and the software, right? But certainly within AMP, we are looking at more optimized charge algorithms. And it's in the context of a lot of the broader things in AMP. And I'd say the basic characterization would be that historically people have charged batteries very simply. I mean, the simplest case, and kind of one of the standards, at least in testing batteries, is you do a CCCV, you do a constant current and then a constant voltage. And it's a good approximation to say, well, let's charge the battery at constant current until we hit the voltage at which we think there is the possibility of negative side reactions. And then we'll keep it at that voltage, we'll make sure that we don't exceed that voltage, and basically kind of charge the rest of the way at a constant voltage. It's pretty clear when you look at the electrochemistry that that's very simple of an approximation, and you could do better. At least theoretically, you could do better, because ultimately the voltage is not what's driving those electrochemical reactions that lead to degradation, and so that's not quite the right limit. Ideally, the limit should be the basic electrochemical side reaction limits, which are more potential driven, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And if you could measure those things, what you would say is, actually, the charge profile would not be as simple. You'd have a much more complex charge profile, and you could potentially charge both faster and to the same level of causing any unwanted side reactions. You could actually get more charge into your battery. So you get more out of it, and you do a quicker charge. And so those things are captured in AMPed. On the hardware side, there are a lot of questions about charging infrastructure and the cost of charging infrastructure. We touch on those in a few other programs. We have a program called ADEPT, which looks at advanced power electronics, has implications for charging. We have You could argue that our grid-scale storage program could have implications for charging, et cetera. It hasn't fit into any of these, but obviously we think there are options for innovation there.
Great. One question taking a step back would be going back to the question of cost. I mean, do you see an area where the person's asking, should the batteries last the life of the car, or how does replacement cost for the battery, how does that get incorporated into it? And so I guess maybe when you're looking at, part of ARPA-E's mission and funding programs is, if it works, will it matter? And so you don't want to spend a lot of time innovating around something that only reduces overall social change by a small amount. You want something that can have a big impact. So we've already talked a little bit about how you see the startup, the initial sticker price of the battery matters more than its overall lifetime durability. But from a technical side, if you think that we have that ability to extend life, even though the cost might not come all the way down, is that something, talk to me about the pressure between the social behavior and the technology. Are we getting to a point where we can make cheaper batteries that will need to be replaced? Is that likely to be where we see battery technology kind of quickly get better in the next 5-10 years? Or is it more, we do think we can have batteries with really improved lifespan, better than we've ever seen? We're just going to have to start socializing a better, willingness to see that lack of replacement as a value.
Yeah, so I think this is a good question. There are a lot of different ways to address this. I mean, I think the question of replacement costs and how long does the battery last, I'll give the amped perspective first, which is it's such an important question, because right now the whole business model for electric vehicles is set up around a big question mark of, we're selling cars to a bunch of people, we don't know exactly how they're going to use them, we're making a guess in terms of ultimately what the life expectancy of the battery is going to be. And so it affects both the sales part of that and the consumer part. So if you look at it from the car company standpoint, they ultimately have to give you a product that they could stand behind. So they have to say, we're going to warranty it for X number of years. And there's obviously risk in that. There's risk in that, there's liability in that. What if for some reason it turns out more people than they expected are actually driving their cars, way more than they expected in the middle of the desert in Arizona, where a lot of degradation reactions can happen, and those batteries don't last as long as they thought. Now, they've built all of that, obviously, into their consideration of how they're building the warranties, but those costs of the risk end up embedded in the ultimate product, right? They have to be captured somehow. On the consumer side, the inefficiency is that you buy a car, and with a regular combustion engine vehicle, you can make a pretty good guess of what the remnant value of that car is going to be if you decide to sell it in 3 years, and 5 years, and 7 years. With this battery question, the buyer of that car is going to wonder, well, how degraded is the battery? And how do I value the battery if I'm going to buy a used car from you right before the battery warranty ends? And so one of the key pieces of AMP is to try and improve the diagnostic capabilities and the prognostic capabilities to understand, could we have sort of a life meter or an easy way to check what that state of health of the battery is, so you could imagine what the resale value would be. And again, that's just going to make the whole market more efficient. So I think that's kind of one of the pieces on lifetime. Now, Adam, you mentioned something which I actually thought was really cool from a sort of program director standpoint, which is you said, well, could you imagine a model where we could get such cheap batteries, but they don't last a long time, and so you just kind of replace your battery every year,
like an oil change.
Like an oil change. Maybe that should be a new program we run at ARPA-E. I mean, that's a cool idea. I haven't seen everything that I think we've seen in the community is more pushing. Let's make the lifetime longer, because we know this is going to be significant capital expenditures. Although some people, I think, have taken approaches. We've heard of certainly approaches to say, what if there was a quick refurbish that you could do, so that every 3 years you bring your battery in and somehow the internal chemistry gets refreshed, and through a chemical process. Those are cool ideas, and I think it's those are the sorts of things that we're excited to hear about.
Well, great. Well, taking the conversation back from the technical focus for a moment, we have a couple questions here about, these will be probably our last two questions before we wrap up at 1:30. asking about maybe the formation of AMPT and ways that people can be involved. One question is talking about, does ARPA-E really advantage or focus specifically on large companies or universities, or I would interpret that, what's the role of smaller companies? And then how, if you don't get selected for the AMPT program, what are the ways that you can still be involved in what ARPA-E is doing, and whether that's specifically open solicitations, maybe talk a little bit more about that.
Okay, yeah, I think these are two great points to end on, because I think these kind of go to, any of you out there who are interested in kind of getting support for your ideas. So on the first question, and I can see the question on the screen here, which is, at least it says this, ARPA-E grantees seem to be larger companies and universities or smaller players disadvantaged. The resounding answer is no. We actually do our best to fund ideas regardless of where they're coming from. But we're looking for ideas that can really make an impact on the problems that we're establishing. So just an example, if you looked at the BEAST program, which was funding new chemistries for batteries, I think BEAST had a number of small companies as awardees, because there were a number of small companies who were active in that space who could address these chemistry problems. On AMPT, I do agree. I think we're skewed a little bit towards large companies, maybe universities, but really there are a lot of large companies in AMPT, not necessarily by design, but I think what we found is some of the large companies or big consortia of teams were able to do a better job of addressing these big system level issues, which need you to understand and be able to test how is this going to actually perform in the context of a real battery system in a vehicle or on a grid, versus just working on the material side, right? You kind of need a different set of expertise. So I think that fell out of the topic area. On the other question, which kind of goes back to the point I made on the fact that once a program like AMPT closes, what are the opportunities for the other ideas that are there that we didn't capture in the program? And I'd say, right now, the main opportunity for that are these open solicitations that we run. I can't talk about whether and when we might do another open solicitation, but if you look at history as the example, we did one right when ARPA-E was established. We just closed another open solicitation, which I guess opened last year. So that was sort of that kind of, I don't know if it set a precedent, but that was in every other year. And I think we're committed to continuing to find ways to capture these innovations in between. Now, that's for funding opportunities from ARPA-E. We have occasional open solicitations. As I mentioned, we're trying to think of how the ARPA-E model could evolve to even, what an open solicitation lets us do is it lets us capture innovations that either did not fall into one of the buckets of a program that we had, so innovations that fell through the cracks spatially, or innovations that fell through the cracks temporally, meaning you had the idea, just not at the right time. And so that's great for a big open innovation. We'd like to actually be able to do that with even higher resolution, so maybe find ways to fund things in between solicitations, et cetera. We don't have that really set up yet. The other thing that I'll mention, though, is aside from specific funding, our goal at ARPA-E is not just to fund a few projects and have those specific projects be successful. My goal as the program director for AMPT is to try and have this whole opportunity space for innovation be successful. And anyone who's trying to transform the space in this way, I would like to support you in whatever ways I can. If we don't have an opportunity, I can't give you money. But potentially with resources, connections, learning more about other things going on in DOE that might be helpful to your efforts, please reach out to me and I'd be very happy to try and help with that.
Great. Well, Ilan, thank you very much for your time today, and thank you to everyone who dialed in and for the great questions. You'll be receiving an email later today getting your feedback on today's session. And, just one other thought on if you are interested in the funding opportunities that ARPA-E has, if you're not already signed up for the ARPA-E newsletter, that goes out at least monthly, and that's the fastest way to find out about our next funding opportunities. So I encourage you, if you aren't already, to sign up to receive that. And in addition, in between funding opportunities, we regularly put out new editions of ARPA-E University. And so today was an open office hour with Dr. Gur. Next Wednesday, I invite you to come back and join us for a focus on licensing with the Department of Energy's Technology Transfer Coordinator, Dr. Karina Edmonds. She'll be joining us at 1 p.m. next Wednesday to focus on licensing and looking at it very much from the sell side. You are a technologist with something. When might you license it? So Ilan, thanks again for joining us today.
Thanks so much.
Take care.